Ever feel like, like you're constantly battling against time, especially as you get older, trying to hold on to your youth? Well, today we're going to dive deep into someone who took that battle to a whole other level, Countess de Castiglione.
She wasn't just some socialite, no. This woman was a political pawn, a pioneer of photography, and honestly, a bit of an enigma.
Definitely a fascinating figure. And what really grabs you about her story is how she used photography. It was revolutionary, but kind of unsettling too, especially for the 19th century.
We've got biographies, historical analyses, even a whole podcast, all trying to figure out this woman's obsession with her image and how far she went to control it.
We're talking hundreds of photographs, meticulously staged, in costumes, like a visual autobiography or
Nice.
something.
A visual autobiography.
So today, let's unpack what made this woman tick, why she became almost fanatical about her appearance, and why her story still matters to us even now.
Especially now, right? I mean, look around. We're surrounded by images, filters, everyone trying to look young forever. It's like we're looking in a funhouse mirror, seeing our own anxieties about aging and self-image reflected back at us.
Okay, let's start with the basics. She was born Virginia Olduini into a wealthy Italian family, and at just 16, she became Countess de Castiglione. But even then, she wasn't your typical countess. She had bigger plans.
Oh, yeah. Way bigger. Her marriage to the Count, it was more strategic than romantic. He was older, totally smitten with her beauty. But he quickly realized this woman, she was aiming for something much grander.
She spoke multiple languages, had this captivating presence, not exactly someone meant to stay quietly at home.
Nope, not at all.
And this is where things get interesting. Imagine being sent to the French court with orders to seduce the emperor himself.
Talk about a high-stakes mission, right? This was the Italian Prime Minister Cavour's doing. He was desperate to get Napoleon III on his side to help unify Italy. And his instructions to the Countess were pretty clear. Succeed however you have to, but succeed.
Wow, talk about pressure. So she arrives at this lavish court full of gossip and intrigue, tasked with charming one of the most powerful men in Europe. Did she manage it?
Oh, she captivated him, all right. Their affair became the scandal of the court. Empress Eugenie was furious. There are stories about these extravagant parties where the Countess would arrive in outrageous costumes, stealing everyone's attention.
It sounds like something straight out of a movie.
It does, doesn't it? Like there's this one account of a garden party where Napoleon just whisks her away for a private boat ride, leaving everyone buzzing with gossip.
Scandalous. But it sounds like it worked. Did her charm offensive actually achieve its political goals? Did she get Napoleon to support Italy's unification?
Well, it's complicated. She definitely won him over, and there were some political concessions, but it's hard to say how much was really down to her. Napoleon was a smart politician, and he definitely had his own agenda. What's undeniable is the Countess made a huge impact. She became a legend. A general at the time even described her as, get this, a goddess descended from the clouds.
Wow, a goddess. She definitely knew how to use her image to her advantage. But this is where things take a turn. She eventually loses favor with Napoleon, gets banished from the French court, and instead of fading away, she develops a new obsession: photography.
And not just casual snapshots. This was a massive project. She worked with this famous photographer, Pierre-Louis Pierson, for decades. They created over 400 images of her.
400 photos. That's incredible, especially back then when photography was still so new. What was she trying to do with this visual autobiography? Was it just vanity, or was there something more to it?
I think it was a mix of things, honestly. She was recreating scenes from her glory days, posing in those extravagant costumes that made her famous, like that Queen of Hearts gown she wore to a ball, almost like she was trying to stop time, to preserve her youthful beauty forever.
It's fascinating. It's like she's embracing new technology, but also desperately clinging to the past. And it's not like she was just a model, right? She was in control, directing these photo shoots, even retouching the photos herself.
Exactly, and that's what makes her so remarkable. She was actively shaping her own image, which was incredibly bold for a woman at that time. She wasn't just someone's muse, she was the artist behind her own visual story. In one letter, she even tells Pearson that God is making him the collaborator of the most beautiful creature who has ever existed since the beginning of time.
Wow. Talk about confidence. But beneath all that, I wonder if there wasn't a sense of desperation, like she was clinging to her beauty as everything else in her life started to fall apart.
Oh, absolutely. And that's where the tragic side of her story starts to emerge. Remember, she was estranged from her husband, facing financial ruin, becoming more and more reclusive.
So the Countess's downfall,
Yeah.
what were the main factors that contributed to it?
Well, her extravagant lifestyle and her fixation on her appearance definitely took their toll. She was living way beyond her means, pushing people away, becoming isolated. There were even stories about her secluding herself in an apartment with black walls and no
No
mirrors.
mirrors. That's a
Yeah.
powerful image. Like, she couldn't face the reality of her fading beauty.
Or maybe it was a way of rejecting those societal expectations, the pressure on women to stay young forever. Her story definitely makes you think about the pressure to defy aging, especially for women in the public eye.
It's a theme that's still so relevant today, isn't it? The pressure to look young, to fit into a certain mold. But what about the photography project? Did she give it up as she retreated from the world?
Not at all. In fact, she went back to Pearson's studio in her 50s and continued posing, often in costumes that would have been more fitting for a much younger woman.
Wait, so she was basically cosplaying as her younger self, even as she aged.
Yeah.
That's a bold move.
Yeah.
How were these later photographs received?
Not well, to be honest. The critics at the time called them grotesque, a sorry spectacle. They focused on her perceived decline, how she looked. They thought her attempts to hold on to her youth were pathetic, even disturbing. But I think there's a bigger conversation to be had here about how we judge women who don't fit those neat little boxes about aging gracefully.
It's interesting because, in a way, she was ahead of her time. Those later photos with the theatricality and the way she deliberately manipulated her image, they almost feel like a precursor to performance art.
Oh, definitely. And it makes you wonder if, despite her seemingly superficial motivations, she was actually grappling with deeper ideas about identity, perception, the power of images.
Like she was both a product of her time, obsessed with beauty and status, but also someone who was challenging those conventions. It's that duality that makes her so intriguing.
Exactly. She was a walking contradiction, a fascinating blend of ambition, vulnerability, and artistic vision.
Okay, that's a lot to take in. We've covered her aristocratic upbringing, her daring political maneuvers, her scandalous affair, and then her retreat into a world of self-created images. And running through it all, this thread of vanity, ambition, and this desperate attempt to control her own narrative.
And we can't forget the historical context either. She was living in a world where women had very little agency, and their worth was often tied to their beauty and their ability to attract powerful men. Her story is as much a product of her time as it is a reflection of her unique personality.
Absolutely. So where do we go from here? What happened in the later years of her life? Did anyone even remember her after she retreated from society?
That's where things get even more interesting. It seems the Countess, even in death, couldn't escape the public eye, and her legacy took a rather unexpected turn.
Ooh, a cliffhanger. All right, listeners, you'll have to wait for part 2 to hear the rest of the Countess's story.
Yeah.
Trust me, you won't want to miss it.
So even though she became more and more reclusive in her later years, she still wanted recognition. She actually wanted to have an exhibition of her photographs called, get this, The Most Beautiful Woman of the Century. Pretty bold, right?
Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely. Like she was trying to rewrite history, to make sure everyone remembered her as this timeless beauty, even as she got older.
Exactly. But her death in 1899, at the age of 62, brought a different kind of recognition. Not the kind she probably would have wanted. She wanted a simple burial, no fuss, not even a mention in the newspapers. But of course, that's not what happened.
Yes, celebrities, even the reclusive ones, they don't really get to control their story after they're gone, do they? So who kept her story alive?
This is where we meet a character who's almost as fascinating as the Countess herself. Comte Robert de Montesquieu. A poet, a dandy, known for his extravagant tastes, and, shall we say, a rather intense personality.
Ooh, I love a good dandy. Was he a fan of the Countess when she was alive?
Actually, they never met, but Montesquieu became utterly obsessed with her after she died. When he heard about her passing, he said, "Time is running out, I must act." He even went to her apartment right before they closed the coffin, just to get a glimpse of her face. He called it pale, beautiful, noble, solemn.
Okay, that's a little creepy, but also kind of romantic in a morbid gothic sort of way.
Oh, it gets creepier. Montesquieu started collecting everything he could find related to the Countess, and I don't mean just a few photos or letters. We're talking about pieces of her coffin, the nightgown she was buried in, plaster casts of her limbs.
Hold on. Plaster casts of her limbs. That's taking fandom to a whole other level. What was he trying to do with all this stuff? Was it like a tribute, or was it something more possessive?
It's a good question, isn't it? He collected over 400 of her photos, wrote a whole book about her called La Divine Comtesse, and even displayed some of this memorabilia in a sort of museum he created.
It sounds like he was trying to create his own version of her, almost like he was trying to bring her back to life through these objects.
It's definitely a strange and kind of unsettling kind of admiration. And you know what's even more ironic? Montesquieu, who was so fascinated by the Countess's narcissism and her desire to be the most photographed woman of her time, he ended up wanting the same thing for himself. He wanted to be the most photographed person in the world.
Wow, talk about the student becoming the teacher, or maybe in this case, the admirer becoming a reflection of the admired.
Exactly. It shows how these things, fame, image, the desire to be remembered, how they can become cyclical.
So the Countess's legacy lived on, even if it was in this kind of bizarre, unexpected way. But beyond the drama and the obsession, what about her impact on art? She was a pioneer of photography, right?
Absolutely. Remember, we're talking about the mid to late 1800s. Photography was still brand new. And for a woman to use it in such a deliberate way to create this kind of self-portrait was revolutionary.
Especially for someone who wasn't royalty or famous actress. She was basically just a private citizen, right?
Yeah, and yet she understood the power of the camera. She used it to challenge conventions, to explore different sides of herself, and to control how she aged, or at least how people saw her aging.
It's like she was a proto-Cindy Sherman. It's amazing to think that her work might have influenced later artists who used photography to play with identity and challenge how we see beauty.
Definitely. And her story is still intriguing people today. Her photographs are exhibited, analyzed. Her life has been turned into plays, books, even Hollywood movies. It's safe to say that the Countess, despite her efforts to control her image, became a kind of enigma, open to different interpretations.
That's the thing about legacy, isn't it? It's never fully in our control. But in the Countess's case, she left behind this visual record that continues to spark conversation. She might not have achieved most beautiful woman of the century status, but she definitely made her mark.
Speaking of making a mark, there's one photograph that's become really iconic. You've probably seen it. It's the one where she's holding an oval cutout in front of her eye, peering through it directly at the viewer.
Oh yeah, that one.
Yeah,
It's so striking. She's covered, but also exposed, like she's looking out from behind this mask. It perfectly captures that mystery, that allure of the Countess de Castiglione.
it's a powerful image for sure. It speaks to ideas about identity, self-presentation, the way we look at each other. It's almost like she's inviting us to look closer to try and figure out what's beneath the surface. But it also suggests that true identity might always be elusive, hidden behind layers of artifice.
That's a perfect place to pause. We've covered so much ground today. Politics, seduction, vanity, art, obsession. It's incredible how one life can hold so much complexity and contradiction.
And isn't that what makes history so fascinating? These lives, these stories, they're not neat and tidy, they're messy, just like the human experience.
But before we get too philosophical, there's one more thing we need to talk about. The lasting impact of the Countess de Castiglione. What does her story tell us about our own relationship with image, beauty, and the way we think about time passing?
Yeah, yes, the real deep dive, right? Where we connect this historical figure to our own lives and ask, what can we learn from her triumphs and her tragedies?
Stay tuned, listeners, because that's exactly what we'll be exploring in part 3 of our deep dive into the life and legacy of the Countess de Castiglione. Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into the life of Countess de Castiglione. We've gone from the glamorous courts of Europe to her kind of self-imposed exile, right? We've talked about her political schemes, her art, and that really strange obsession she inspired after her death. But now for the big question. What can we actually take away from all of this? What does her story tell us today?
It's easy to just label her, like, oh, she was just a vain, ambitious socialite, a product of her time. But I actually think her story holds up a mirror to our own times. It makes us think about some uncomfortable stuff, about how obsessed we are with image, with beauty, with not aging.
It's kind of eerie how much her struggles resonate with our culture today,
Sure.
right? Everywhere you look, it's curated online personas, filtered photos, this pressure to be perfect. It's like we're all trapped in this countess's web, chasing youth and wanting everyone to like us.
Exactly. Think about it. The pressure to look young, successful, flawless online, it's exhausting. And it really echoes what the Countess was going through. Her anxieties about getting older, about how she looked. Her whole life was dedicated to preserving her beauty. And it makes you wonder, are we so busy trying to project a certain image that we forget to just accept ourselves, to make real connections?
That's a good point. Makes me think of that saying, comparison is the thief of joy. For the Countess, it seems like constantly comparing herself, chasing this ideal image, it robbed her of any real happiness, any self-acceptance.
That's a really insightful observation. The Countess's story reminds us that beauty fades. No matter how much she tried to preserve it, time still caught up with her. It shows us that real beauty, it's not about how you look, it's about character, experiences, connections.
That's a beautiful way to put it. It makes you shift your focus from being young to living a meaningful life. And while her story definitely has a tragic side, it also makes you think, introspection.
Absolutely. Her story makes us look at our priorities, our relationship with image, what really matters at the end of the day. It challenges us to find our own definition of success, of fulfillment, beyond just superficial things.
So, wrapping things up, what are we left with? Is it a cautionary tale? A glimpse into the past? Or maybe a reflection of our own anxieties and hopes?
I think it's all of those things woven together. The Countess de Castiglione's story shows us that wanting to control your image, fighting against time, it's a human thing. It's something we all deal with. It makes us think about how much control we really have over how we're seen and what happens when that image doesn't match reality anymore.
And maybe the most important thing is that it makes us think about the legacy we want to leave behind. It will be based on how we looked or something deeper, more meaningful. That's something we should all think about.
Absolutely. It's been an amazing journey exploring this life full of contradictions. It reminds us that history isn't just dates and events, it's about people and their stories and how they can teach us about what it means to be human.
We've gone through the life of a woman who charmed emperors, broke artistic boundaries, and left a legacy that still fascinates and challenges us. So until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep looking for those hidden gems that make history come alive.